Starting when you're young is usually not taken as seriously as this individual takes it. He happened to be a natural podcaster from day one, arguably. Inquisitive, curious, and based on my research, just wants to know how to be a better you, how things work, how to find success, how to build success. And for better or worse, over the last few years, this individual has spent some time with some pretty incredible individuals asking those questions. And he's built a network, he's built a podcast, he's built a life around what does it take to be better you. Today, you're going to meet the host of The Casey Adams Show, Mr. Casey Adams, a podcaster, an entrepreneur, an investor, newly married, and more. Please welcome my friend, Mr. Casey Adams. How are you today, bro?
Jonathan, I loved that intro. Thank you so much for having me on, my man. I'm so excited to be here, and I'm doing great. I mean, as you said, newly married, so I'm on a high right now this past month.
Well, let's bring you back down to earth.
Yeah, man, for sure. Literally, we need it.
So 400 episodes just about, huh?
That's right. I feel 400 episodes and many other, side quest interviews that probably didn't come out as full pods, but hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of interviews and, feels like tens of thousands of questions at this point.
And what would you say is that common thread that you're trying to figure out in asking all these questions and doing all these hundreds of interviews? What are you trying to figure out?
I mean, you hit on the head. And I think, as someone who is obviously still young, I'm 24, turned 25 in July. I feel that I'm in this point in life where, I mean, as you said, I recently got married, but I started this journey of my podcast when I was 17, just coming out of a neck injury when I was almost paralyzed in high school. And I think my answer to that question, what am I trying to figure out? It's changed so much over the years. And I think that, I always talk about my purpose of why I do this show continuously, even, at this point, 8 years in, is it's to meet great people, learn from them, and hopefully create some type of business opportunity. And I think those three key points that have always been so constant in my life has evolved so much. And I think so much of the podcast is a reflection of where my focus is at that time, meaning in the early days of the podcast, I'm interviewing young entrepreneurs because I want to meet other young people that are doing cool things. Then it was, starting my first software company in 2020 and raising capital. I'm start interviewing lots of venture capitalists and, talking to startup founders. And then in the last 3 years, I run a marathon every year. Then I started interviewing some ultra marathoners and athletes and all these great people. And I think the common thread through it all is I tend to live my life through the lens of my podcast in the sense of, in this information era, there's an abundance of information. You can learn anything so quickly in this AI era. But I believe especially as AI is ramped up, like the human conversation and how you can learn from human experience, I have learned to value that much more over these last handful of years, especially with AI and ChatGPT and all that great stuff. But to put a point in this question, I think I'm always trying to figure out and learn from the best what I'm interested in, what I'm dealing with, the problems in my life. Even the common thread of being married the last 6 months to a year while I was engaged, I had so many phenomenal guests on. And I think it's probably 50% of the conversations we end up going on this massive tangent about marriage and kids and family and the intertanglement of how you manage all of that. So wherever I am in life, the podcast has really reflected that. And I think it's been a superpower to how I've grown so much as an individual over the years.
Listening to how you talk about the evolution of the podcast based on where you're at in your life, I mean, I obviously relate. Whatever I'm trying to build, whatever area I'm trying to grow in, if it's content creation, if it's running, if it's personal development, if it's writing, if it's reading, whatever it comes down to, the podcast, I mean, Dan Churchill, I remember when I interviewed him, he talked about how it's his own personal MBA. I have an MBA.
Yeah.
But ironically, there's just so much more experiential learning that comes through having conversations with people of wisdom. I had Michael Gervais on the podcast, and he talks about how you can cultivate a sense of mindfulness and personal growth through conversations with people of wisdom. You've sat down with some pretty cool people from when you were 17 years old all the way up until now. you kind of touched on what it is that you're working on and what you're trying to figure out. But ultimately, where do you see things going in the podcast world?
I love that question because I think now more than ever, especially as someone that's building a new software company in the world of podcasting, I believe that over the last 8 years, I got into like podcasting because I learned to love it, right? The actual creator format of sitting down with people, interviewing people. And it really wasn't until like really the last 2, 3 years where like the podcast industry and really what that means has become at the forefront of how I'm viewing like building businesses in the space. And I think it's different than just from like building a software company, but the actual podcast industry, I believe, is there's so much reporting and information out there on like what a podcast is, and it's changed so much over the years, right? I mean, I remember when I started my show, there was not all these incredible tools out there to help you record, to help you publish, to help you create short form. And to your question, like where do I see it going? I believe that the last 8 years, from my personal experience, the medium of podcasting and even what it means has matured so much, and it's become this media powerhouse, right? And I was talking to someone the other day who has been this like podcast industry like executive for nearly 15 years, and you know the mainstream appeal of podcasting to it influencing elections, to all these big celebrities having shows, to now Netflix getting into podcasts, to these massive 9-figure deals with people like Alex Cooper and Rogan, and all of these just acquisitions in the space. So much money and time and effort and attention is poured into this medium, where I think that if I was starting a podcast today and I was stepping into this industry in 2025 versus when I did in 2017, I would have a much different perspective on it. And I think the beautiful part about it, though, is it is still so incredibly early. I mean, one, just in terms of all things social and how much that has evolved, but two, in terms of podcasting as a format and the opportunities within that. I think when you see people like Stephen Bartlett, who are turning down $100 million deals and building out their own media companies, there's so much behind the scenes that people aren't aware of, where, you might see someone like a Jay Shetty or a Stephen Bartlett and you're like, oh, like they have beautiful production, they have all these subscribers, but what you don't see is maybe the 30, 50, 60 production team members, media team members, that A/B testing and all the stuff that makes the shows so successful, which I think nowadays you're starting to see a little bit more of that, especially with, people like Steven who are building in public. But, to the question, I think the most important aspect of the podcast industry is understanding one of three things. One is it's here to stay. Two is it's matured so much and the medium is so early still at this point. And three, there's more competition than ever, but there's still so much room to find your unique voice if you are someone that's looking to step into this world. And again, I think that it's one of those things where this idea of what a podcast even means is changing so much. Like yesterday, YouTube put out their like top podcast list. They just came out with this whole list format, and there's a couple shows on there that are just YouTube podcasts that don't even have, traditional RSS feeds. They're not on Apple, they're not on Spotify. And it kind of is like that blending word of like what a podcast even means. Is it just an interview show? Is an interview show a podcast? Like what is it and what is it not? So we could talk for hours just about that. But I think in terms of, where is it going? To exactly what I just said. I think the amount of investment and maturity and standardization of what it, where this industry has become is really cool to see, especially as someone that's, I like to say my entire career has been sort of built on the foundation of podcasting, from all my companies to the funds I've raised for my businesses. So yeah, a lot of exciting stuff in that format.
It's a great take because with all the tools that are available, all of the faces of the industry and all the production that goes into it, while it's an audio format, kind of piggybacking off of, video kind of piggybacking off of the audio format, you learn that the microphone's more important than the video in a lot of ways, right? My camera is about to die, so we're about to show the evidence-based case of this, dealing with all of the technical difficulties. But the point is, when you look at an industry, especially when it's in its early stages, right? Like you're talking about, listen, I guess if you're looking at Rogan and talk shows and radio shows, I'm reading this book by Pat Williams. He's former executive, the Orlando Magic. He's the guy like that brought the Orlando Magic to Orlando. And he talks about his experience on having a radio show at the same time. And I just kind of inject the word podcast every single time I see radio show, because he was this person who wrote tens of books on leadership, but also like asked tens and tons of questions to people of wisdom, we'll call it, just kind of following his curiosity. And everyone kind of starts their journey for different reasons. For me, it was largely about, how do I become a better me? And how do I show people that they can do whatever they want to overcome the hardest things that they'll ever deal with? And this is how high performers, or at the time when I first started, the everyday person. I interviewed a breakdancer about how she dealt with hardship. That was one of the first things one of my first episodes, one of my first 10 episodes. And it's funny thinking about it now, because 7, 8, 9-figure entrepreneurs, F-16 pilots, global best-selling authors, we've had some of the same guests. It's like, when you look at the evolution of things, whether it's your own show or an industry, and you see the seasons that these things go through, and where you look at the horizon around where things are going, to your point, podcasts are here to stay, but they also played, especially within this last election, like such a massive role in this new media element, right? Where now it's not so regulated around what people can say. You could speak so freely that you're really getting to know someone, and it's such an intimate experience that you feel like you have a relationship with these people. Who are some of your favorite podcasters in the space right now?
It's changed a lot over the years. I think that, when I look at a great example of someone in this space, I believe that Stephen Bartlett is by far one of the most intuitive, forward-thinking podcasters. And I remember too, when we used to chat on Instagram back in 2017, 2018, we probably started our shows around the same time. Just seeing the execution that him and his team have had, they just crossed 10 million subscribers. They, I think the Forbes article said they're bringing in like 20 to 25 million a year just through the show. And I believe that someone like Steven or Harry Stebbings, who has really used his podcast as a vehicle for an investment fund, I think that's sort of the out of the box thinking that I've tried to apply with my show. That I think I look at all the big shows, and of course there's advertisers on, a lot of the big podcasters are making the most money, obviously, but I believe podcasting is a vehicle for so much more. And a little fun fact that I like to say, and then I'll get back to the question, is during my first tech startup, we raised a round of funding from 37 angel investors, and pretty much 90% of the investors were past guests on my podcast. And for me, that was sort of a full circle moment of how this medium has allowed me to not only grow as an entrepreneur and a founder, but how it's opened doors. And you see that with people like Harry Stebbings, who, he closed a $400 million VC fund. I think it was his third fund at 28 years old. And he started his podcast, 20VC, in I think 2015, ran it for probably 10 years. And then he raised, initially a $5 million fund, $10 million fund. And then it went all the way up to a $400 million fund, because he was interviewing and getting advice from some of the top VCs in the world, and then applied that to his life. And I think who are the best podcasters that I follow? I think I like to follow the people who are using the medium for things beyond just, the host itself. And those are two that stick out to me that I'm always super inspired by. But I think on the flip side, people like Mel Robbins and her impact on the space, and Jay Shetty, who I've known for a while, and I had Jay on my show in 2018. Seeing the scale in which these individuals have grown their shows and their communities and their movements is not only just inspiring in terms of how big they've gotten, but the true impact and the closeness of relationship with their viewers is just so inspiring. Where, I feel like I could walk up to anyone on the street here and say, oh, Jay Shetty? They could say yes, but then I could ask them how has he impacted you and what have you learned from him? And there's so many personal, messages and takeaways and learnings that these podcasters are creating for people because of the depth that comes with the medium, right? And I believe that the people that have made the most impact on me are people that are the most vulnerable, that have really grown the medium overall, that have moved the industry forward. And I think that, that genre of people I just mentioned are wonderful, but people that maybe the audience hasn't heard of, there's one person who sort of a mentor to me. His name is Richard Tate, and he has a new podcast that it's like top 10 in the health and wellness category right now under Huberman and Lewis Howes and all these guys. And he's interviewing like recovering addicts, and his business. He had one of the biggest rehab facilities here in California. And his show, there's an episode where he's sitting down with someone that, is going through withdrawals, and he sort of talked him or her into like going to rehab and getting therapy, and like seeing the emotion that he's evoking from his guests, because he makes it feel like you're not on camera and that you're just talking to, a therapist or someone that's there for you. And his show, I believe, is going to be not only huge, but it's already making a huge impact that I love to see.
I love the way that you talked about some of the people that have inspired your journey and been influential, and some of the ones that you like to follow, because I mean, for me, I go through phases also. And someone that I'm listening to a lot recently is David Senra on Founders. And this dude is just like on a tear right now. He is like getting all the accolades and recognition for what he deserves. And it's like you see the thousands of reps and the meticulous nature and the focus. And he loves to talk about how he continues to edit his own podcast. And I remember the days when I was doing that, and it's like, oh, I'm kind of spread too thin. But to his point, and he'll cite like the importance of attention to details and why it matters. I mean, recently I was listening to an episode that he did. I listened to his interview on Patrick O'Shaughnessy, I think, and then I listened to a follow-up interview, a follow-up episode on Todd Graves. And the thing that kept coming up was this idea of, I forget who the entrepreneur was. It might have been Rockefeller. He talked about how there was this focus on soldering within their business, and they were using 40 drops of solder to close cans or whatever they'd have to deal with. To the guy that's manning the machine, he's like, well, have you tried 38 drops? And he's like, no. So he tries 38 drops, and some cans start loosening up. He's like, well, why don't we try, or leaking out, why don't we try 39 drops? And that one drop difference ends up saving him in the long run, as the business scaled, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so that focus on attention to detail, he takes when he's editing his podcasts and takes out, those 1 second differentiator markers that save people time and energy that even he doesn't, that they may not necessarily know, but he pays attention to. And you see how he's kind of systematized all the information in his head over time, exploring all these different journeys. And for me, it matters because when I have that kind of, I don't know if you know Eric Jorgensen. He wrote the Almanac and Naval Ravikant. And he talks about this idea of downloading someone's iOS, or like their operating system or their software. And obviously he did that for Naval. He did it for Balaji. And, he's gone on to start his own fund. And for Senra, I mean, it's those ideas of all these different entrepreneurs he's just downloaded into his head that he can constantly refer back to. How has interviewing hundreds of people impacted your operating system?
I love what you said there. And I believe that the formats, even before diving into the question specifically, there's the interview shows, there's the health and wellness shows that I love, but the two shows that are in that same vein, in my opinion, are, Founders by David Semra, and then the Acquired podcast. I think that the level of depth that those two shows have is so inspiring, and quite frankly, something that I think about a lot of, like, wow, if I ever wanted to launch a different show where it's just me, no guests, what would that look like? And I take a lot of notes from both of them because they're just incredible what they do. And I think it's really inspiring. But yeah, no, this idea of like operating system, I believe I get the question a lot of like, oh, what have you learned from all these guests? But I love the way you put it in terms of operating system, because I think that from 17 to now almost 25 in July, if I think back on these nearly last 8 years, I recognize how much information I've soaked in, but how it's really applied to my life in the context of, my brothers are, I'm the youngest of three, and it's obviously a lot harder to change your habits, brain chemistry wise past 25. It's like scientifically, it's when your brain activity, or excuse me, it's like your habit forming time in life. But the people I've interviewed, you might ask me, oh, like, what was your biggest takeaway from X show? And I might not be able to recall it immediately. But if I really take time to think about each show with each individual, there'll be stories that pop out to me that come to fruition. And I think that these stories that have come from these conversations I've had are similar to how I have big takeaways in books, right? Like thinking about right now, Tillman Fertitta, who I had on my show, the owner of the Rockets, there was a rule in his book and a story where it's called the 95-5 rule. And he would always walk around pretty much every restaurant he had and he would pick up the trash. And that small little gesture is a story that, not only has a rule, the 95-5 rule, like focus on the 5% of things that people don't see, like, as David Senra would say. And I was just on my honeymoon just last week, and something I always do that kind of, if I see something on the trash, on the ground and it's a small piece of trash, obviously I pick it up, and everyone should be doing that. But I think when you attach meaning to something around, like, yes, you can pick up this piece of trash, but having rules and laws and stories to reference in your life of why you do things, I think is super empowering, from the way you train in the gym to how you treat people to, how you analyze questions. Larry King's quote that influenced not only my interview style, but also the now name of my company, listener.com. Larry King had a quote on my show that was a very iconic quote of his, which is, I've never learned anything while I was talking, therefore be a great listener. And I think sometimes when I'm in, going to a networking event or just in a room with people I don't know, that quote will come up to me if I either notice I'm talking too much, or if I'm not talking, I could be listening, but I'm not actively listening and my mind's wandering. And I think that there are these quotes or moments or lessons or stories that tend to bubble up in my consciousness very frequently that have deeply impacted me from all the conversations I've had over the years. And I think it goes back to one of my good friends, Brandon. He said one day in my kitchen, he's like, you kind of just like view the world through your podcast, where if you go downstairs in my refrigerator, you'll see these, brands of the founders that I've interviewed, or, oh, like, how'd you hear about this? Oh, it was the founder of this company actually recommended it. Like, the podcast is sort of like my, how I'm able to pull things closer into my life. And I think that's such an empowering feeling of being able to, and I know I'm going on a tangent here, but, to be able to know the people around everything that you are doing. From, like, right here, I have a melon hat, which is a hat brand I love. And to know the people that are creating it, to know their story, to know what they've gone through, to know the hardships of all the things that are like in your close proximity. I think that's my, biggest takeaway, and how I've downloaded it into my brain is you just realize that everything around you has dealt with challenge, has dealt with story. Then there's so many lessons to be, learned through that.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Inside the Inspired. My name is Jonathan Cohen, and I have a quick favor to ask you. If you're getting any value out of this content, please take a second to subscribe to the channel. You help us reach more people, and you can also stay up to date with all the latest content coming your way. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll catch you in the episode. I know exactly what you mean. I love how you articulated it, bringing those things, like pulling those things into your world. It's so cool to like engage with the different people that have influenced you or impacted you in some way, shape, or form. Or if you were curious about them, the second you get an opportunity to meet them, you can get an insight where you may not necessarily recall immediately, oh, like, that question's so generic. What was the biggest takeaway from all the episodes? I mean, I always try to identify common threads. So if someone asks, like, what's your show about? I can always relate back to it. But at the same time, like, I am going through this phase right now where I'm going back to old episodes and reading the transcripts to pull out the best ideas and repurpose content around that. And it's so funny reading the transcripts relative to listening to the episode. And I've listened to, I would say, 98% of all my episodes back, just because some might get like, I don't know if you have this, like oh God, like cringe about it. I don't want to hear what I had to say. Even if it was a good episode or in the moment, I was like not feeling it. And after the fact, I'm like, hey, that wasn't so bad at all, actually.
Yeah.
I did kind of well over there. So did the guest, obviously, but you knew they were going to pull their weight. You want to make sure you're maximizing their presence. And so for me, going back and reading the transcripts has been transformative in a big way because I'm revisiting ideas that at the time I thought I knew and I did, but I pick up on something else that the guest said that impacts me differently that I wish I had realized sooner. So over the last few weeks, it's been very, like I said, transformative because you can distill those ideas back and relate back based on all the other experience that you've accumulated. And I'd be very interested to see what that's like for you, knowing what you know now about your show and everything that you've accomplished. I mean, you interviewed Larry King when you were 17. How many times have you listened back to that one?
It was 2019. I just turned 19. I've listened to it a lot, man. I think especially too, like there's been a handful of guests who, have passed away over the years. And even more recently, like one of my good friends named Dingo, who professional snowboarder and just such a light in life. And it makes me emotional because you're able to go back to these moments. And of course, there's the knowledge in it, but I can relive this moment of, my friend Dingo, like talking to me when I'm 18, 19, 20, like, dude, like you have no idea, like the amount of momentum and like energy you have for life. Like, do not lose this. And, I can look at that now and now being, again, still young, but having gone through so much more life, like personally, the ups, the downs, I recognize like, wow, like that energy that I was harnessing when I'm 16, 17, 18 with, no fear of judgment, no, like not getting in my own way that I may feel that I do more now. I look at that and I think, whether it's Larry King or my friend Dingo, those are interviews that I tend to go back to a lot more. And I think it's one of those things that is truly like a time capsule where you can listen back and like relive a moment with someone that, is no longer here and they were talking to you then, but it can almost feel like they're talking to you now as well. And some of the things that they might have said then, as you mentioned, didn't come across, but then you'll hear it a second time and you're like, wow, like if only I, took that to heart the way I just took it to heart now. I think moments like that are really just unique, and not only does this medium provide that, but I tend to go back to those episodes a lot for sure.
It's so important to have that willingness to go back and learn and revisit those conversations. I feel like rereading books, listening to podcast episodes, whether it's your own content or content of others, it's that reinforcement learning in a big way, especially if there's been a delta in this time and space since having those conversations. And I can imagine that just being in the energy and gravity of people that you've had the opportunity to sit down with, whether it's billionaires, millionaires, athletes, and any kind of author or high performer that's inspired you in some way, shape, or form. Can you share maybe going into every conversation, what's your plan of action?
I love that. And it's changed a lot over the years. And I believe that, nowadays, when I think about my show today, I think there's an element of every guest is so different. Every conversation is so different. And my approach to interviews today, I try to not have too much of a blueprint of specific questions at all. Like I have topics I want to cover. I have things I'm curious about that I sort of note down when doing my research. And I think that for me, what's allowed me to be so like have longevity and have so much excitement about every single interview I still do is because I don't make the preparation for each show like so daunting where it takes up, days or hours or not hours, like just so much time where it's just like, oh, why am I doing this? I think for me, it's about having a genuine curiosity for every single person I have on the show, doing my research and understanding, their story, the context, and then kind of understanding in my mind, like what do I not know about them? What would I want to know about them? Like, what are some questions I would have? And like, what am I curious about? And then most importantly, I think my format's like 45 to 60 minutes. And for me, it's just meant to have a great conversation diving into their story and kind of meeting them where they are today. Right. And I think again, like seeing people like Chris Williamson and some of these shows that are like very much so longer format, 2, 3, 4 hours. I may start testing some episodes like that with some guests because I think sometimes it's so easy to just go do the same format, the same style, which I feel that I've done over the years. But for me, it's very exciting. It feels great. I'm my most natural in it. But I go into each conversation with just like, what am I looking to learn? How can I kind of, again, like meet them where they are today and not just always make it a monologue where they're talking about, their background for 30 minutes. And then we talk about like what's in their life today for 10, 15. I try to, jumpstart like where they are now, what they're dealing with now. And of course, like tie in the story and their the story of who they are. But yeah, it's different every time. Some guests I do way more research on. Some guests I feel like I know so much about them where I don't want to clutter my mind with every single little thing. And I just keep the curiosity open. And I think that's what made Larry King so great. He didn't have any questions. He was quite the listener. He would ask the most direct questions and he would just be curious about each person. And I try to apply that to the best of my ability in every episode.
Interviewing is a skill and it definitely has different iterations to it. I think also the way we've gone about talking around podcasting, its impact, its influence stylistically, and some of the top performers right now in the space. I mean, you're naming all the people at the top of my list. Patrick Bet-David's up there. I think his has turned more into a political show than a podcast, but nonetheless, I still am a fan of him. So it's shifted kind of in the content, but otherwise, those are some of the top. Chris Williamson, David Senra, they're probably, for me at least, what are most in my ear these days. It used to be Diary of a CEO there for a season. I think Steven's very talented, obviously. So does the market. It's one of those things where it's so dramatized that it almost like I don't want to deal with that. And I'm also kind of in a season where there's this idea that I got from a 9-figure entrepreneur on track to be a billionaire that I know pretty well. And he says this thing where if you have too many voices in your head, you can't hear your own. And so I've gone through this season where over the last few months, I've been training for a sub 3-hour marathon. I got a 3-hour and 39-second marathon in Toronto.
Wow, dude. 3-hour, 39-second. Whew. Oh my goodness, man. Congrats on that.
Thanks, man. And I appreciate that because at the same time, I'm like, God damn, like I was right there and I was really hoping for it. But it's funny because on one side, I never thought I'd be able to train for something like this. And I haven't really been talking about it because I haven't been doing too many interviews post. I think this is my first interview post, my first sub 3 attempt. And it's been one of these things that in September, I ran a 58-mile ultra. In November, I did the New York City Marathon on 318. And
I ran the New York City last year as well.
I think we were going to do this live and like it just didn't work out. Yeah. So it was too bad. But, we'll have to run it back and hang out in person. When I did that, I was like super shocked. I would have been grateful for 330.
Dude, 318 in New York
I was very proud of that and like without real training. And I appreciate that. And like I did one long run. The rest were like 7, 8, 10, like nothing crazy. And I like mentally, I just needed the break. And then in February, I just had this idea in my head. I was like, I'm going to go for it. Like, why wouldn't I? And I think a big part of how people think is playing small. From an early age, I mean, arguably, you haven't been playing small at all. You've only been playing it big. The people that you have interviewed, the ambitions that you have, talking about being an investor, an entrepreneur, barely 25 years old, and you're having these conversations with these unreal humans. I mean, how has being around I know from my own experience where I was placing limiting beliefs in my own life consciously and subconsciously, and this sub 3 is a prime example. Why can't I? Just because that athlete or that high performer, like, what's preventing me from doing that? Like, why can't I cut 18 minutes off my marathon time and something I didn't even train for? And I'm someone who couldn't make a team in high school. I had shoulder surgery. Like, I am not an athlete, bro. I've become something else. But like, at the same time, like, how how have you cultivated this courage to stop playing small?
I love it's ironic you say I'm not an athlete, but now you're out here like literally the top 0.01% of people that will ever run, right? And then of course do a marathon, right? It's I think that's ironic, and it's something I want to point out because it's incredible. And then even too real quick, and I think it ties into a bigger story, which is I don't know if you know, but Jimmy DeSico, one of the co-founders of Super Coffee, I don't know if you have heard
Yeah,
of
he's been
this,
on the
but
pod.
okay, incredible. So I don't know if you know about his marathon stories, but he's trying to break sub 3, and he got 3 hours and 1 second in I think the Austin marathon. And then to make it worse, he did it again and got exactly 3 hours and 1 second. And
Those are like his
I,
first two attempts. He talked about
yeah,
it on
first
the
two
pod.
attempts. And I remember seeing that, and I took away so much from it because it's so easy to be so critical, right? Like 1 second off, right? And like 1 second, what does that mean? And I'm forgetting who the quote is by. I think it's Tony Robbins. Is he talks about like the tenth of a second, where in the Olympics, the difference of a tenth of a second is the person you know about and you put on a pedestal, and the tenth of a second later is you never know their name and you never will because they came in third, fourth, fifth, sixth. And it's like, Tony Robbins talks about like raise your standards, and to be good, to be great, and then to be outstanding. I think there's so much to that of like how people, and to your question of like having big ambition and playing it big. I think, something Andy Frisella always talks about is just how naturally as an entrepreneur, like the double-edged sword in life is it's hard to be satisfied. And quite frankly, you're never satisfied. Even someone like him who's still, climbing the mountain and, has achieved so much. It's like ingrained in you once you step into this identity of like growth and wanting more, and not even wanting more, but like trying to be better, and to shave that 18 minutes and then to shave that 39 seconds off, or the 1 second. It's and I think that's the beauty of not only just entrepreneurship but personal growth. Not everyone has to be an entrepreneur or should be an entrepreneur of that sense, but the mindset I believe that that started when I was 16 years old. And something I like to reference is, I come from a very small town in outside of Richmond, Virginia. I didn't fly on an airplane until I was 16 years old, when I bought the plane ticket myself. And the worldly perspective of just like quote unquote what's possible, like growing up, I dreamed about going to California and like leaving the country, and still, to this day, like no one in my immediate family has passports, have left the country. And, I've been to, I think, like 18 countries. And I think it's one of those things where it's so easy to forget how much you've grown over the last 2, 3, 5 years, and just to be thinking about the current, the future, like, what you're striving for, but to take a step back and to recognize how much you really have grown, and how the things you have today, like you would have dreamed you would do anything for if you could go back in time. And again, to the point though, like striving for more, playing it big. It's funny you say that because sometimes as we all do, I'm sitting here like, oh, like I'm not doing enough. I should be doing so much more. Like,
Yeah,
as we all do so naturally. But
not
to think
everybody.
about, yeah, no, you're right. You're totally right. But to think back, and that's why I love this format of
Unfortunately,
like being a guest on this side of it, right? Like to think back to the 16-year-old version of myself. If he could talk to me today and be on the other side of the mic, I would just be so blown away and so grateful for my commitment to the journey and the process. Because I think at the end of the day, the biggest lesson that I've learned from all my guests is just keep going and never quit. And I think there's an element of like delusion that is baked in that is the unseen of like in moments where you shouldn't keep going or the world is telling you not to keep going and you just simply do keep going. Like those are the moments that, people tell stories about. Those are the moments that people don't see in the moment. But I think for me, it drives me to be surrounded by so many people that not only believe in me, from friends, family, people I've interviewed. It's it's really inspiring, right? To see friends of mine, people I've interviewed to just continue to grow. And I think that's one of the big realizations over the years where so many people I interviewed in 2017, 2018 have obviously gone off to like grow so much. People like Jay Shetty, or my buddy Iman Godzi, or like I could go on and on and on and on and on. And it's funny how it's like, wow, like you spend so much time trying to go after these quote unquote like big timers, huge people and names when you're young, but you kind of naturally fail to recognize that the people that are right around you today are the people like the movers and shakers of tomorrow. And I think over the years that's cemented so much in my mind of just how I've continued to cultivate relationships with people, not only my age, but my friends and how much they've gone out to do. And I think it's so cool to see of just like having that, that support system and, really choosing who you are spending time from and who you're building with. It's really cool to see. And, even people like Jake Paul, right? I remember I interviewed him in 2018, right before his first boxing fight with a YouTuber, and we're sitting in his basement, and it's like, oh yeah, I'm gonna do my first YouTube fight, and to see what he's done, it's just like, wow, like the people right in front of you, the people that you can maybe have conversations with. Everyone's on their own journey, and you can learn something from anyone around you, no matter how big or small, quote unquote, they may be now or today, right?
So let's talk about that for a second. Skate where the puck is going. How have you kind of cultivated that intuition, would you say? I'm not going to sit here and say, to clarify, that you anticipated the success of every single person that you interviewed, right? But at the same time, there was something about them that drew you to be curious about who they are. I feel very much the same way. But at the same time, like, how have you? I've been fortunate to have guests at the peak of their career come on the show and arguably, watch a lot of them grow. Some of them regress, some of them plateau. How have you, I mean, because you have hundreds of episodes and hundreds of examples, how have you, or what would you say is that thing that helped you intuitively identify how to skate where the puck is going?
I don't think there's a strategy to it. I think it's just a curiosity, right? Like I've interviewed people that they're not on social media and they're just so interesting and fascinating that someone introduced me to, and they ended up being these like massive names or people that like I didn't know much about their company, and then I learned more, and you're like, wow, they've built such an empire, but no one would ever know because it's like so private. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just always be curious about anyone that you meet, and I believe it's thinking about like software companies as well, right? Like when you see an MVP for a product, chances are it's not, this beautiful, well experienced, user experience. But you hear from the person like, oh yeah, this is what it's going to be. This is what it's going to be. And I've felt that firsthand as someone that's built, tech products before, where there are so many mentors in my life that have believed in me, like before I kind of believed in myself in certain aspects of it, whether that's I'm raising money or I'm, going out to like interviews with these people, like going back to the first like 100 interviews. And I think it just goes back to curiosity, man. I really think it does. I think you can learn something from anyone around you. And if there's an element of like growth oriented person, they just need to be watered. And I think there's an element of just being in the right rooms and saying yes to opportunities, not knowing where they're going to go. And even I try to do that today. Like the last 4 weeks of my life has been super busy and crazy. And now I'm going out to London as like a last minute trip next week because I think it's going to be valuable. And I think there's moments where I'm doing more things like that more often than I'm not. But I've always found that in moments where you're like, should I go do that? Should I go to that event? Should I go to that, should I go have coffee with that person? The moments that I do are the moments that I never have regret on it. But it's the regrets of like, oh, I should have done that. Oh my God, I thought about doing that, but I didn't do it. Those tend to sit with me so much more. And I think that's from should I interview this person to should I go to this event? And I try to, view those patterns in my life more today.
Let's spend a couple minutes talking about listener.com. What is it? What's the mission? And where's it going?
By the time this comes out, we will be officially live. So we're doing a big announcement this upcoming Monday, which is super exciting. So by the time this comes out, I'm sure it'll be live. But overall, I think in this modern era of podcasts, to even going back to the beginning of this conversation, like the word podcast and like listener has changed so much. Where what is a listener? Where are they listening? YouTube's the biggest podcasting platform, and our whole goal with listener.com is to be a listener analytics tool for modern podcasts and podcast teams. And, what does that mean, right? Like our initial go-to-market is this beautiful listener dashboard that allows podcasters like you and me or large networks to best represent their shows beyond just the traditional listener data of downloads and plays. Because in this era of people like Jay Shetty or Alex Cooper that are selling merchandise, doing live events, doing brand deals, being, partnered with companies, whether that's like beverage brands, et cetera. How do you get a holistic view of the show from the data, the analytics on and off platform? And for us at listener.com, that is what we're doing. And it's actually coming off of an acquisition we made of a podcast tech product in the space and recently integrated into our tech stack. But it's really a listener analytics tool for modern podcasts to best represent themselves when pitching brands, when pitching guests, when pitching any partnership idea. And that's the beginning of it. But really, we want to be a sales enablement tool and a monetization engine for this next era of, I like to say, podcast 3.0, where again, the listenership as an industry is just continuing to grow. The professionalism that has come with it, the deals that are in the space. We want to be that like infrastructure layer that is widely adopted from every independent podcaster to large network at scale.
It's awesome, man. I'm hyped for you. It's a massive step. I know when we first connected, I think it was last October-ish, around then. I think we were talking about where listener.com was going and to see that it's about to take this massive step and you really stepping into the vision and the identity of entrepreneur. You already had it, but now to take another step for your own brand. I'm excited for you. I also know you got the set of the Casey Adams show all refined and primed. So that's also super exciting. There's a question that I posed to all my guests that I'm not going to pose to you. You kind of alluded to it earlier, but I'm going to ask it now anyway. If the future version of yourself from 10 years from now were to fly in and offer you some advice in order to get there, what do you think they'd say to you?
I think it's a great question. And it's also a great time in my life where, I recently got married and I'm someone that, we didn't talk about it a lot during this episode, but my now wife, Jacqueline, we've been together, it'll be 5 years in this month in May. And the support that my partner has had in my life and the people close to me have had, like, that have provided in my life, I think my advice would be like, spend time and never let something, of less importance get in the way of what's truly important, and to really spend time on the things that matter, whether that's time with family, time with your wife, time with your future kids. And again, I think it's a very simple thing to note, but I believe that, over the last 8 years with being so focused on business as I still am, it can be a very selfish and selfless endeavor, right? You want to build, brand credibility, like build an empire in a sense. And I think that as I've now gotten married, you kind of adopt this new mentality of like building and the us mentality, and your natural tendency to just focus on yourself just diminishes like immediately. And I think my advice would just be like, know your priorities and continue to focus on them. And quite frankly, like, be present every step of the way. That's something that every time I have a journal entry, which is daily, I write sort of a note to myself from the like future version of me. And it's always just like, be present and like take in this day, because like you never get to relive this day. And I think that's the element of how I live my life, is just the presence, the gratitude, and really trying to prioritize what really matters, while also, of course, going out and having these big dreams and ambitions and you know, what I'm pursuing overall. So I think that would be my advice.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Casey Adams, thank you so much for bringing me back to the OG version of how I used to film these things. It's very fitting that this would be an episode that we go back in history only to arrive back in the present moment. Thank you so much for your time, legend. Where can people keep up with your journey?
Yeah, so I appreciate you, first off, Jonathan, for having me on today. Definitely had such a great time. And best place to follow me is just at Casey on Instagram, CASEY. And my website's caseyadams.com, where you can learn more about all the projects, investments, and companies I'm a part of. And of course, the new company's listener.com. If you're a podcaster or ever looking to start a show, it's definitely something that can be extremely valuable. So those are the 3 best places. And yeah, always happy to answer any questions about anything.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode. If you got any value out of this conversation, please rate, review, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And follow Casey, because he's about to launch this massive, massive company in listener.com. Thank you so much. Until next time, my name is Jonathan Cohen, and this is Inside the Inspired.